We are up to verse 11 on day 3. God had first gathered the waters into one place so that the dry land would appear. So Genesis seems to be indicating if water's in one place, so would be the dry land. And so if you had to figure out, if you had to fall on one side or the other of an argument about is it multi-continent or one continent, the grammar here would lean definitely in the direction of a single continent earth at the beginning stages before the flood. Verse 11, then God said, let the earth sprout vegetation. Now that's interesting. That makes vegetation the very first created life form. Now it is not life like animals or humans. And what would be one of the biggest differences between vegetable life and animal life and human life? Things like intellect, emotion, will. On a biological level, what would be differences? Animals and human beings are mobile. They can move around. They're self-contained units that carry a life with them wherever they go. Animals are rooted. You take them out of the ground, they die. But a major difference between plants and animals that's going to play into theology later is what? Even though they have a form of life, they do not have biologically. They don't have blood. And that's going to be significant. Animals and human beings have blood. Plants do not. I'm not trying to be gross here, okay? But this is going to become something that plays into how the rest of the scriptures play out. Now, this contradicts evolutionary theory, which has life somehow beginning in the ocean, not on dry land. Genesis is teaching that God begins with vegetation. And he goes on to say here, let me keep reading here, let the earth sprout vegetation, plants yielding seed and fruit trees on the earth, bearing fruit after their kind with seed in them. And it was so. The earth brought forth vegetation, plants yielding seed after their kind, and trees bearing fruit with seed in them after their kind. And God saw that it was good. And there was evening and there was morning, a third day. Now, I want to take this moment to talk about an issue that may or may not be in play here. And it's the issue of God creating things possibly with an appearance of age. There are some who say that in this text, it talks about the fact that God creates these I'm going to call it vegetable life forms, okay? Plant life forms, according to their kinds, by the way, with seed in them. Now, the text says that they sprout from the earth, okay? So they rise from the earth. So did God begin the growth process and they come out of the earth? That seems to be the way the direction of the text is leading. Some would say, no, God actually creates the first trees and plants more or less fully grown with the seed already in them. And if he does it that way, then we have what's called an appearance of age, okay? An appearance of age. And by the way, they were created here before the sun. I forgot to mention this. The sun isn't created till day 4. So if days are millions of years, and you want to still allow Genesis to be telling you something, then it would be saying that God created, plants millions of years before the sun. That would create just a biological problem. How are these plants going to proliferate for millions and billions of years without the sun being there? I just planted some grass behind my house, and part of it's growing really well, and part of it's not. And the difference is, part has sun and part doesn't. But if you stick with what Genesis is plainly teaching, plants are going to have to go for 2 days, one day, until the sun comes into play the next day on day 4. So if days were ages, then vegetation had no sunlight for a long time. But coming back to what I was starting to talk about, bearing fruit with seed in them might indicate an initial creation with an appearance of age. Now, I would say this. By the time you get to Adam and Eve, my opinion is that God did create them with an appearance of age. God forms Adam out of the dust of the ground. He forms him, it would seem, into a full-grown man. Because he then forms Eve, and he tells them to be fruitful and multiply. You wouldn't say that to a baby at 1 day old. So yes, indeed, Adam and Eve seem to be created with an appearance of age. Now, some would say, this is dishonest on God's part, to be doing something that looks like it's old when it's not old. But the simple solution to that is to just simply say this, that God isn't being dishonest with us if he tells us that that's how he does it. If you go to Lowe's or Home Depot, you're going to see door handles that say aged bronze on it. And from what's on the packaging that door handle wasn't made 100 years ago and then aged gradually over time. It was made to look old. So is the manufacturer being dishonest with you? Should we take them to court? Will we stand any chance in a court of law to sue them for that, for misrepresentation of their product? No, because they're not being dishonest. They're telling you what they've done there. It's obvious what they've done. They've aged it to look old. Now, that's not a perfect illustration, but if God tells us that this is the way he does it, there is no dishonesty problem whatsoever. You know, one of the interesting things that I like to wonder about is how old will I be in heaven? Like when I get my brand new glorified body, like what's the perfect age? I don't know. I feel 22 years old in my head right now, but when I look in the mirror in the morning or look on the calendar, it tells me something different. You know, but I don't know. I don't think that age will even matter in heaven, because I think, based on all I'm reading in the Bible, we're going into a timeless situation once we're in heaven. You know, we sing about that in some of the old hymns, when time will be no more. Can you imagine being in a timeless state? So how long is eternity? Well, you can't say, because there's no such thing as long amounts of time. In fact, if there's no time in heaven, the people who are already there are not waiting for us to join them. They're not in a time-space continuum mode there. Anyway, I'm getting off track. That's not in Genesis. But this whole aging thing is interesting. How old will we be in heaven? I think it's pretty well a moot point. Well, continuing on here, our reading, we come to day 4, verses 14 and 15. Then God said, "Let there be lights in the expanse of the heavens to separate the day from the night, and let them be for signs and for seasons and for days and years, and let them be for lights in the expanse of the heavens to give light on the earth." And it was so. Now, I underlined a few words in the text. You can see it in your notes. God creates these lights in the expanse, which includes the sun, includes the stars. We're going to see that in just a minute. But he does so for what reason? For signs and for seasons and for days and for years. God clearly intended that celestial bodies should serve as, number one, signs. Now, what is a sign for? A sign does two things. It announces something or it points to something. It announces something or it points to something. So how are the celestial bodies signs? What are they announcing, and what or who are they pointing to? Now, Genesis doesn't tell us, but the rest of the scriptures do. Psalm 19, I think it is. The heavens are declaring the glory of God. When you look out to the stars and you're blown away by the vastness of just the Milky Way, let alone the entire, visible thing that you can see, which is an infinitesimally small part of the universe, it really does, if you're, open to it, boggle the mind. And it's a sign. It's pointing to the greatness of God. It's announcing the greatness of God. It's directing your attention to a creator. But also it says here that they are for seasons and for days and for years. Now, all of this seems to indicate that stars were initially visible. In fact, let me just keep reading just a few more verses here. Verse 16, God made the two great lights, the greater light to govern the day, the lesser light to govern the night. He made the stars also. Isn't that interesting? It's almost like a throwaway statement. I mean, he made the stars also. What? Like billions upon trillions. Yeah, he made the stars also. Move on to the next topic. I mean, this is a ginormous, incredible, creative God. And by the way, if you think that God is really boring and single-minded, you haven't noticed the sheer diversity of his creation. Why so many colors? Why so many tastes? Why so many smells? Why so many emotions? Why so many textures? Because we don't have a boring God. We have a God who is incredibly creative. And I'm thankful that not all food tastes the same, amen? Although if it does, it should taste like Doritos, is my opinion. Because I think that that's what grows on the trees in heaven. But anyway, that's just my opinion on it. But it does seem to be that these were visible. I mean, how could they serve as signs if you couldn't see them? Which then begs the question, how could starlight be visible right away if those stars are so far away? This is a very legit question. Like, we know that these stars are thousands and millions of light years away. In other words, it's taken that long, supposedly, for light to travel that distance. Does not prove that the universe is very, very, very old. Well, it would if you presuppose certain starting points. And believe me, there's a lot of people that are working on this particular issue. And there are kind of three big ideas on this. I'm going to give them to you in the order, I think, personally, of what makes some sense. Some say it's that they were created with an appearance of age. I personally have a bit of a problem with that, because that would mean that any star that's currently beyond somewhere around a 6,000 to 7,000 year horizon, if a supernova is visible to us beyond that horizon, the supernova never actually occurred. God would have had to create the picture of the supernova somewhere along a light beam, demonstrating an event that never actually happened. And if that doesn't make sense, that's fine, because I can't really explain it well in 20 seconds. But more reading that you're going to do will unpack that better than I can. But some would say that God created the light beams already in place. Another thing is that light traveled faster back then. There is evidence that that is possibly true. And if that were true, that would change a lot of things. And some of you that are really into physics and all this kind of thing are going, what? Like, how could that possibly be? There actually is good scientific work done on that particular issue. But a lot of the more recent work that's being done on it centers somehow around this rapid expansion of the heavens in the beginning of creation. That as God stretches out the heavens, that means that at the initial day, 2 or 3, 4, 5, 6, the stars are not as far away from the earth as they are now. And as God is stretching them out, they take on this great distance. And I am greatly simplifying something here that really isn't within the scope of my course here to try to unpack all the physics and the science behind it. But if you really, really enjoy this kind of stuff, and these types of books don't put you to sleep at night, like one that's relatively short, that will really get your, thought processes going, is one entitled Starlight in Time. I think the guy's name is Humphreys. Dr. Russell Humphreys unpacks this quite nicely, but believe me, there's a lot more work that's being done on it as well. And I will just refer you guys to that if you'd like to unpack that a little bit more. But how could they be signs when the majority can't be seen by us today? Possible answers to that: maybe human eyesight of Adam and Eve was far keener, than what we have today. We just assume that Adam and Eve are like us. That is a major assumption that actually wouldn't fit with the biblical evidence. Adam and Eve were created in a state of perfection. When death processes began on their bodies, it took over 900 years to finally kill them. Their bodies were starting from an incredible start point, and I don't think that we really even have a clue what the bodies of Adam and Eve were capable of doing. So, did God create them initially with eyesight that was much keener than ours, not only more sensitive than ours, but perhaps functioning on a much wider spectrum than the spectrum of light that we see today? All of that is allowed for in the biblical text. Romans 8 talks about the fact that the creation was subjected to futility, and one day it will be set free again into the glorious freedom of the children of God. So that might be one way. Perhaps the entire universe was somehow accessible to them. The Bible doesn't say this. The Bible doesn't say this. I want to be really clear about that. But, is it possible that in the original intention of God, Adam and Eve had the ability to actually go places beyond this earth? And you say, wait a minute, like rocket technology wasn't yet, invented by that point. Well, maybe the situation was such that they didn't require rocket technology to move around. I know of a human being that's done it. One day he just levitated off the ground, and a cloud hid him from view, and he left Earth's atmosphere. His name is Jesus. And Jesus was functioning with a glorified body post-resurrection. That's a different body than the one he had before his resurrection. He was able to appear, disappear, go through walls, levitate off the ground, and yet he was still able to eat and be touched by people. And it would seem as though he was able to travel at the speed of thought, which is faster than the speed of light, and he seems to have been able to even change his physical form so that people didn't recognize him at first. And it says in Acts chapter 1, as he levitated off the Mount of Olives, a cloud hid him from view, but just before the cloud hid him from view, they watched as he strapped on duct taped 2 bottles of oxygen onto his back so that he could exit the atmosphere. No, it doesn't say that. In Acts chapter 1, it doesn't say that he levitated off the ground and a cloud hid him from view and suddenly his body came flopping back onto the earth and his spirit returned to heaven. It doesn't say that. It says that he left this earth bodily. And my friends, I'm here to tell you, the angel said, this same Jesus will come back in the same way that you saw him leave. We believe in the bodily return of Jesus Christ to planet Earth. And in that day, his feet will stand on the Mount of Olives, Zechariah chapter 14. The Mount of Olives will split in 2. Half will move to the north, the other half will move to the south, and he will make his great and glorious triumphal entry into the city of Jerusalem. Make no mistake about it, I don't think we have any clue about what God is capable of creating in terms of a physical body that can do things that we have no clue of today. So Adam and Eve may have had the ability to access the then known universe in ways that we don't know anything about today. Notice also that God intended time to be divided into days and years by those celestial bodies, right? Seasons, it says, to let them be for signs, for seasons, for days, for years. And we're still doing that to this day. We're using the movement of the celestial bodies to chart out time for us. And so the whole concept of calendarism, okay, that's what I call a Stroudism. A Stroudism is when a word doesn't exist. It should exist, so I just make it up. So calendarism, okay, this concept of dividing time up into units, putting it on paper, marking it off. It's a very, very helpful practice by people who live within time, right? And where does that practice come from? From the very opening pages of Genesis. The celestial bodies were put there to divide into days and into years. And by the way, you know, they divided into regular days, just regular days. In verse 16, it talks about the sun and the moon, the two great lights. They are not the greatest lights, okay? They are not the greatest lights, but they are the brightest from our perspective. And by the way, I forgot to mention, but it is in your notes, that it's interesting that from this point forward, the text of God's word uses precise months and days, counts them out. I'm going to just leave this topic right now because we're going to come back to it, but it counts out days and years and months in very, very precise fashion. And how can you get that level of precision? God put celestial bodies out there specifically for signs and for seasons and days and years. And so we have the two great lights in verse 16, the sun and the moon, the brightest from man's perspective. He made the stars also, end of verse 16. God placed them in the expanse of the heavens to give light on the earth, to govern the day and the night, to separate the light from the darkness. And God saw that it was good, and there was evening, and there was morning, a fourth day. This is all very interesting, right? Because it roundly, once again, is at odds with evolutionary theory, which has the earth forming with the sun, or usually after the sun, which makes the sun present before the earth ever is present. The Bible teaches the opposite. The earth comes first, and the sun comes on day 4. The ancients used to worship the sun as being the creative force. I wonder if God deliberately waited to day 4 to put the sun in play so there would be no mistaking the fact that it wasn't the sun that was the origins of the earth. The earth did not originate the sun. So the earth. The sun did not originate the earth. The sun was often worshipped in ancient history as being the creative force, but God makes it clear here that the sun had nothing to do with creation. It is itself a created entity. You come to day 5, and we read in verse 20, "Then God said, 'Let the waters teem with swarms of living creatures, and let birds fly above the earth in the open expanse of the heavens.'" Once again, you have a contradiction with evolution because evolution claims that everything begins with one microscopic single-celled organism. But the plain wording of the biblical text is that God just brings them into existence, already formed according to their kinds. And starts here saying, let the waters teem with these things, swarms of living creatures, and birds flying above the earth. So we have marine life and birds being created. Verse 21, God created the great sea monsters. Now, when we hear the word monster, we immediately associate this text with legend, fairy tale. But the word just simply means a big animal, a big being. And even to this day, the largest animals on planet Earth are not walking around on dry land, they're in the oceans of the world. And even from a biological standpoint, there's some good reason for that, because lumbering around on land with a multi-10 tons, being, as opposed to letting it float in liquid, you can see the difference between the two. It's a lot easier to float that kind of weight. And so the great sea monsters, whales, are still the largest animals that have ever lived, even when you count what we at least know of so far of the dinosaurs. Although a lot of these animals, I just read this morning, like the blue whale is somewhere below 25,000 left on planet Earth. Ginormous animal. And so let me keep reading here. He created the great sea monsters and every living creature that moves, with which the waters swarmed after their kind, and every winged bird after its kind. And God saw that it was good, and he blessed them, saying, be fruitful and multiply, and fill the waters in the seas, and let birds multiply on the earth. And there was evening, and there was morning, a fifth day. Then you come to day 6, and you have to break day 6 into 2 parts. Because the first part's going to deal with land animals, and then the second part of day 6 is going to be the apex of God's creation. When he creates not an animal, but a human being in his own image. And so I'm going to start obviously with part 1 of day 6, which deals with land animals. Reading at verse 24, then God said, let the earth bring forth living creatures, now watch this, after their kind. And I underlined that. It's not the first time it appears, okay, because if you back up into verses 20 and 21, it talks about them being made after their kind there as well. But let me just address this particular issue here in verse 24. Let the earth bring forth living creatures after their kind, cattle and creeping things and beasts of the earth after their kind, and it was so. And God made the beasts of the earth after their kind, and the cattle after their kind, and everything that creeps on the ground after its kind, and God saw that it was good. Clearly, this after its kind thing is important. It gets stated 9 times in the Genesis, in chapter 1, that God creates after their kind. The idea is that God has set specific categories of created animals here, and he creates them according to their kind, and they are to reproduce after their kind. This, again, directly contradicts evolutionary theory, which starts us out with basically one kind from which all different kinds proliferate, life from non-life. So you go from this kind of animal transitioning into a completely different kind, then transitioning over millions of years into a completely different kind, and so on and so forth. And so you have this ongoing search for these intermediate fossils, right? These half one kind of animal with half another kind of animal, and these are supposedly available in great supply, okay? Transitional forms. Not. They're not available in great supply. When we look at the fossil record, and we haven't really talked about the fossil record, we see millions of buried animals, but they are kinds, not transitional forms. Completely formed, like it's not, oh, we found one with half an eyeball. You know, we found one with half of this, half the other thing. Of what use is a half-formed eyeball? If survival of the fittest is the operative principle, then you have this little teeny mutation that puts a little bump on somebody's front of their face. That's the beginning of the eyeball. Like you need billions more years to get a fully functional eyeball. It would have coded out long before the millions and billions of years would have played out, because it is of no advantage until fully formed. No, Genesis teaches creation according to kind and reproduction according to kind, and that too is a complete contradiction of this idea of transitional forms, one species jumping into another species. And within kinds, there can be a lot of diversity. You know, you can crossbreed certain kinds of animals because they're very, very close to one another, and they probably all go back to an original created kind. But don't try to crossbreed a robin with an alligator. It ain't going to produce a robigator, you know? It doesn't work biologically. So even in the way we see things playing out today, there are these boundaries between kinds, and God built that into the system. And it says here, also creeping things, cattle and creeping things. So insects would fit into day 6. God is creating creeping things. And so that's interesting, because once again, if days were long ages, then plants that were created on day 3, created millions and billions of years ago, apparently then, would have had to go all that time without the advantage of insects pollinating them. No, Genesis is teaching plain days. We take it or we leave it, but we can't get it to say something different than what it's saying. Well, you come to verse 25, and I've already read it. But let me read it again. God made the beasts of the earth after their kind and the cattle after their kind. You know, people ask, where were dinosaurs in the creation account? The question is no different than asking, where were lions? Where were horses? Where were dogs? When were they created? First part of day 6. Dinosaurs have reached such legend status, almost fairy tale status in our culture, that somehow it seems odd that dinosaurs wouldn't be included in first part of day 6 when God created the beasts of the earth. But from a pure logical standpoint, why could they not be in there? What makes them somehow any different than any other kind of animal that gets created? So dinosaurs are created along with many other species here in verse 25, and they have become extinct like, guess what? Many, many other species as well. But somehow dinosaurs, as I've said, have reached legend status, where just by virtue of how awesome, I guess, they look, they clearly had to be somehow in a category of their own. But there's no even biological reason why they would be in a category of their own. God would have created them along with all of the other land animals. In fact, in the book of Job, which for many reasons we believe to be one of the oldest books in the Bible, has a text in it that seems to be very clearly describing dinosaurs. And somebody who believes in millions and millions of years would go, well, that's impossible. Why? Because they've been dead for millions and billions of years. Well, what happens if the Bible's actually describing it? You say, well, where is that? Well, for example, in Job chapter 40, behold now Behemoth, which I made, as well as you. He eats grass like an ox. Behold now his strength in his loins, and his power in the muscles of his belly. He bends his tail like a cedar. The sinews of his thighs are knit together. His bones are tubes of bronze. His limbs are like bars of iron. He is the first of the ways of God. Let his maker bring near his sword. That little sentence, he bends his tail like cedars, is interesting because in many translations into English, rather than translating it behemoth, they translated hippopotamus or elephant. Have you ever checked out the tail of a hippopotamus or an elephant? Doesn't look nothing like a cedar tree. Nothing like a cedar tree. It's not like this. It's this little cord dangling out the backside. No, this is an animal that has a tail that's comparable to a cedar tree. Minimum, something like that. That's what the text is describing. It goes on to say this: can you draw out Leviathan with a fishhook, or press down his tongue with a cord? Behold, your expectation is false. Will you be laid low even at the sight of him? Who can strip off his outer armor? Who can come within his double mail? Who can open the doors of his face? Around his teeth there is terror. His strong scales are his pride, shut up as with a tight seal. One is so near to another that no air can come between them. This is a very scaly animal with very impressive scales on it. They are joined one to another. They clasp each other. They cannot be separated. His sneezes flash forth light. His eyes are like the eyelids of the morning. Out of his mouth go burning torches. Sparks of fire leap forth. Out of his nostrils smoke goes forth as from a boiling pot and burning rushes. His breath kindles coals, and a flame goes forth from his mouth. And people read that and they go, there you go. Proves the Bible is just a bunch of fairy tales. Fire-breathing dragons. Well, what happens if in early human history there was such an animal? What happens if our legends of today are grounded in some measure of fact? Is it impossible for God to create an animal that could shoot fire out of some part of its body? No, because there's still one of them around. It's small, but if you can give me some sound, I'm going to play you a little clip about this one.
When you typically think of beetles, you don't think of things that can hurt you or that are particularly interesting. They just crawl around you and step on them occasionally. But there are certain types of beetles that have a really famous defensive mechanism that actually can hurt you. They're called bombardier beetles, and they defend themselves by detonating explosions inside their bodies and spraying out hot, nasty chemicals. So hot that it's the temperature of boiling water.
All right, pretty short clip, but I'm just saying this, friends. If God is God and he can create a beetle that shoots fire out of a strategic part of its anatomy, I don't see no reason why God can't create a bigger animal that does it from the other end of its body. Now, it begs the question, why would God create an animal that could do that? I don't have the slightest clue. But some of the animals that I look at today, I don't know why God created them. I don't know why God gave them necessarily the particular function that they have. Maybe Adam and Eve could use an animal that could provide fire for them when they needed it. I don't know. But to just simply disallow it with no sort of backing and no sort of rationale as to why it could not be is not fair game. We have an animal that does it on a small scale. Why could God not create an animal that did it on a larger scale? And if that were the case, and if that animal had become extinct, I would fully expect that within the annals of human history, there would be legends about such an animal that would arise. That would just totally make sense to me. Continue on, one last little bit of reading from Job 41. He makes the depths boil like a pot. He makes the sea like a jar of ointment. Behind him he makes a wake to shine. One would think the deep to be gray-haired. Nothing on earth is like him. One made without fear. Some people say this is talking about a crocodile, but that is not the original word. It's Leviathan. And it says here, he looks on everything that is high. He is king over all the sons of pride. I'm sorry, but crocodiles don't cut it quite to that category. I mean, they're pretty impressive, but to call it like the king over all the sons of pride is kind of an understatement for a current day crocodile anyway. So the biblical text clearly allows for this, and okay, so then what about Noah's Ark? Like, how in the world do you fit a massive T-Rex onto Noah's Ark? What idiot would put a massive T-Rex on Noah's Ark? Like, if the point is survival of the species, you don't take an old, lumbering, nearly dead 40-ton T-Rex. You take a young T-Rex, and guess what? We're all born the same way. We start small. So you take a small dinosaur onto the ark. It is not a problem whatsoever. But people scoff at the idea, not realizing that there is the most simplest of all logical explanations. It makes total sense that animals would have been on the ark. And young dinosaurs would have clearly fit on the ark. Genesis 6:19 says that there was of every living thing of all flesh. And all means all, and that's all that all means, it's all. So dinosaurs were there. And they were to bring two of every kind into the ark to keep them alive. Unfortunately, a lot of us have been done a great disservice in our childhood because we went to Sunday school and we had our little Sunday school flyers and there was these little pictures of the ark. And it was more or less just a rowboat with a few smiling animals looking over the gunwale on the side, waving at you. Normally has a giraffe and a lion. I don't know why. It's always a giraffe and a lion. And it's like, you couldn't be farther from the biblical text. Let the Bible tell you what it's telling you. It's not a little teeny rowboat. It's a massive box. In fact, if you park it next to a Boeing 747, it dwarfs it. It has 3 decks on it. And there is a full-grown T-Rex dinosaur compared to that ark. So I guess if you wanted to, you could, but again, you'd be an idiot to do it. Not to mention the fact that it's going to eat a ton of food. So why would you bring a big one? You would bring a baby one. This is a model here of, I don't even know where this is anymore. This is many years ago I took this picture. But the thing I really wanted to show you about this picture, and many of you have already gone to see the full-scale size ark that just opened last summer, but here are full-grown dinosaurs to scale, okay, compared to the ark. So if you really, really had to, which again, it just boggles the mind why you would take a full-grown, but if you had to, you could fit one on there. You could fit many of them on there. So what happened to them? Once again, it's not rocket science. They gradually disappeared after the flood. If they were originally vegetarian animals, which we'll talk about later, they would be returning to a situation where their food supply had been more or less completely devastated. The atmosphere may have changed. You talk about climate change, there was probably massive climate change related to the flood. Dinosaurs probably had a very difficult time in the years following the flood. But whatever explanation you want to give to it, why would it be odd to posit the idea that dinosaurs died over time, as so many others have died out over time? In fact, extinction has been the norm now for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. Here's just very recently, there are now 41,415 species on the IUCN Red List. 16,306 of them are endangered species threatened with extinction. That includes both endangered animals and endangered plants. The species endangered include 1 in 4 mammals, 1 in 8 birds, 1/3 of all amphibians, 70% of the world's assessed plants on the 2007 IUCN Red List are in jeopardy of extinction. The total number of extinct species has reached 785, and a further 65 are only found in captivity or in cultivation. So extinction is the norm. So the idea that dinosaurs, along with many other animals, cease to exist at some point is totally, totally logical, very rational to believe this. Now, it's interesting that there's a lot of good evidence to suggest that dinosaurs, many of them existed perhaps even into as late as the Middle Ages. I don't want to take a lot of time here because there's plenty out there to support what that statement is saying. But here's just one example, okay? Here's the tomb of a guy who lived from 1410 to 1496. So check the date out. He's dying in 1496. They bury him. Bishop Bell, well-known person apparently. And so he has a highly decorated tomb. His tomb and the artwork representing the bishop and his garments show that he was a highly respected individual. Now, what is of particular interest are the drawings which surround the perimeter of his tomb. What's the year? 1496. And around the perimeter of the tomb are many, many animals, including ones that anybody today would say, that's a dinosaur. For example, here's a couple of them right here. What are these animals? Here's another example. You say, well, that's a hippopotamus. Not according to the tale. So, the perimeter of the tomb is decorated with images of well-known wild and domesticated animals, including fish, dogs, birds, pigs. Everybody agrees that there are images of dinosaurs there. Everybody agrees. Now, here's the problem. The year is 1496. The word dinosaur isn't even coined until 1841, and the first dinosaur skeletons to be correctly reconstructed don't appear until about 100 years after this dude dies. So what are they basing themselves on to give us a correct representation of dinosaurs when they don't even have the first correctly reconstructed ones until 100 years later? How did they know how to draw them correctly on the perimeter of his tomb? A couple of options. They were way smarter than we thought. They had dug some of these up, correctly reconstructed them, and then the whole thing was forgotten for 100 years. Or secondly, they were just super lucky. Or thirdly, they had actually seen specimens of these animals. If not in their immediate vicinity, somewhere on planet Earth, and they had been described. There were likely some types of dinosaurs still living in his day, is the most rational explanation. And why could it not be? Well, dinosaurs died millions and billions of years ago. Well, in 2005, they dug up a T-Rex femur that still had fresh blood vessels, and tissue found inside one of its femur bones. And in the Los Angeles Times on March 25th, they say this, quote, in bone blasted from Montana sandstone, fossil hunters for the first time have discovered the microscopic soft tissue of a T-Rex preserved almost unaltered inside a bone since the dinosaur died 70 million years ago. Now, I don't know how we get blood and stuff to stay fresh for 70 million years. In fact, the translucent vessels at the bottom were so elastic that when one was stretched out and then released, it snapped back like a rubber band. And so you say, well, what about that? Is that not evidence of that this animal didn't, die, that died fairly recently? No, that's not possible. Why? Because dinosaurs went extinct millions of years ago. So now we have to stretch by faith to believe that, ligaments and whatnot, vessels can remain elastic for millions of years, 70 million in this case. To my knowledge, quote, preservation to this extent has not been noted in dinosaurs before. That's an understatement, said Mary H. Schweitzer, a paleontologist at North Carolina State University. The tissues are still soft. Bottom of the page there. Indeed, a quick examination of 3 other dinosaur specimens revealed similar microscopic tissues inside the bones. Under current theories, organic molecules should not last more than 100,000 years. Is it possible, if dinosaurs died off not that long ago, what would we expect to find? Some with soft tissues. We find them with soft tissues. That's not possible. They died millions of years ago. It's like, don't confuse me with any evidence. So here's what's happened with dinosaurs. The Bible says they were formed on day 6. They were fearless. They became fallen. They went through a flood, and a lot of them were fossilized. They faded after the flood. Now they are found. Now they're turned into fiction. It's an unfortunate thing. 65 million years ago is when apparently they roamed the earth. Well, we continue to read, and we come into what is one of my favorite parts of chapter 1. Day 6, part 2, Adam and Eve. Then God said, I'm going to read these verses as an entirety, and then I want to take some time to unpack this amazing portion of Scripture. Then God said, this is sometime later in day 6, let us make man in our image according to our likeness, and let them rule over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the sky, and over the cattle, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth. God created man in his own image. In the image of God he created him. Male and female he created them. God blessed them, and God said to them, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and subdue it and rule over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the sky, and over every living thing that moves on the earth. My dear friends, brothers and sisters in Jesus, this is one of the most critically foundational passages in all of God's Word. It would be hard for me to overstate how important these few verses are, because it's going to lay down some foundational concepts for us. Genesis doesn't fully unpack them here, but they are so fundamental to understanding the world in which we live today and something about God himself. And so I want to put these up here. You already have parts of these already in your notes. 3 foundational concepts. And the first one is this, that God is intrinsically relational. Now, I forgot to say when I talked about calendars that through my notes I'm going to have portions of them that have a red box around them. And what does that red box represent? That's simply trying to highlight the 23 theological and practical concepts that arise out of Genesis that I wanted to highlight. And at the end of your notes, you're going to have a full list of all 23. So I've already talked about calendars, just a practical concept, just a practical idea that arises out of Genesis. This is now a theological concept, that God is intrinsically relational. What do we mean by that? Well, if you look at verse 26, you have God talking to himself. Now, normally when we see people talking to themselves, we check to see what's wrong. You know, like maybe you need one of these white coats that ties in behind. You know, I don't know. But, by the way, time out here. Learning to talk to yourself is one of the most helpful things in the Christian life. David does it all the time. Hey, soul, why are you downcast within me? Hope in God. Get with the program, dude. Who's he talking to? Himself. And this is not in Genesis here, but it's just a practical idea. There are times, my dear friends, where you're going to have to take your stand on the truth and talk some sense into your own heart. Hope in God, Mark. He's been faithful. Don't distrust him. So, end of time out on that. Coming back to this, we have God is saying, let us make man in our image. And so, even though the text doesn't explain it yet, somehow we discover that God is, I'm going to put it this way, somehow a multiple within himself. It's the first hint of the Trinity. It's the first hint of what the scriptures will unpack later on. So as I said yesterday, don't expect Genesis to explain everything that it introduces, okay? But it's telling you how it played out. Let us make man in our image. You're going to see it again in chapter 3 and verse 22. Let me just read that one to you. God said, behold, the man has become like one of us, knowing good and evil. You can see it again also in chapter 11 and verse 7. Come, says God, let us go down and confuse their language. So without explaining it, the text somehow opens up something here that God is somehow a multiple within himself. Now this is really, really, really interesting. Have you ever wondered how it is that in our universe that we're living in, relationship is so important to our well-being? Like we've all experienced loneliness, right? Why is that a factor? Where do we get things like love and empathy and companionship, fellowship, to use a biblical word, that are so important to the human experience? Out of where does that arise? It's very, very difficult to logically provide an explanation based on mere chance, that through a survival of the fittest we would develop love. Through a survival of the fittest we would develop empathy and compassion for one another and relationality. But if the universe was created by a God who already enjoys that type of thing within himself, and if that universe is an expression or a manifestation of who that creator is and what he is like, then we would expect beings to be in existence in the universe that have relationality built into the structure. And we do have that. We do have that. In fact, the Bible tells us that God isn't just capable of loving, it tells us that God is love. Now, this begs a really interesting question. If God is love, who in the world was around for him to love before he ever created anybody? Don't get in your mind the idea that somehow God was lonely for all this time, and so he created mankind so he could love somebody. How would he even know how to love? How would he be love if there's nobody around to love? Well, the answer to that is really quite simple. He loved within himself before the world ever began. John chapter 17, Jesus says, Father, you loved me when? Before the foundation of the world. And that explains why the universe is relational. And it also explains how God can be love before there's any human being around to even love. There was love functioning within the Trinity. And so the universe in which we live is reflective of that. We see these components, and we would expect to see those things if there is indeed a God of love, and a God of compassion, and a God of relationship. And that is indeed what we see today. By the way, I think there are other ways in which the universe reflects God. Have you ever noticed how much about our reality is in groups of three? We have past, present, and future. We have solid, liquid, and gas. We have three primary colors. We have three, there's another one that I'm missing. But if you just think about it for a while, it's amazing how many things. It takes three things to get stability, like a stool needs three things to have stability, three legs to have stability. There's others that I'm missing. They're just not coming to my mind. Is that just pure chance? You know, the perfect sermon has 3 points? Just kidding. Maybe that's a reflection of the triune God that created this universe. We have 3 dimensions. There's that we know of. That's one that I had forgotten. We have 3 dimensions that we know of. You know, width and height and depth. Is all of this just mere chance? Or is it a reflection of the fact that there is a triune God who created it? And so this is the only way to have a creator God who even knows how to love. So one of the things we get out of these verses is that God is intrinsically relational. And very quickly, even though we don't have the time to unpack it all, we learn secondly, and this is super foundational, that man is created in God's image. Man is created in God's image. Let us make man in our image, according to our likeness. Verse 27, God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him. Male and female, he created them. This is never said of animals. It's never said, let us create the cow in our image. Let us create the dog and the cat. No, only said of human beings. And we're going to find out in Genesis chapter 9 when they step out of the ark and God institutes capital punishment that God is going to explain why it is murder to kill a human being and it's not murder to kill an animal. And the core of it lies right here. It is because men and women are created in the image of God, and it sets them apart from the animal kingdom and puts them on a completely different level than any other created being, created in the image of God, referring to man's spiritual resemblance to God, his creator. God is spirit, and so are we. We're not just flesh and bone, we are spirit.